All right, so we are nearing the end of the Hickory series. I think we're going to do one more after this one. But just as kind of a refresher, I want to do a quick lightning round review, going over the hickories we've already covered. Okay, so starting with the first one we did, mockernut hickory. Can anyone tell me the Latin for mockernut hickory?
Monoecious.
That's the specific epithet.
Oh, it's
Caria tomentosa. And then just really quickly reviewing what a binomial is, scientific way of describing a species. The genus is going to be the binomial, meaning it has two parts, two names. So the genus is going to be described in the first, and then the specific epithet in the
second. And
so the species is
altogether.
the whole thing altogether. Yeah. All right. And then what does tomentosa mean?
Pubescent.
Pubescent. And so how is that helpful with mockernut ID?
Well, it's
That's
very
hairy.
Yeah, hairy. And what part of it?
racist.
Yeah,
The rachis.
rachis, the petioles. All right, what are a couple other quick ways to identify mockernut hickory? How?
Smell of the petiole.
Yeah, so Craig's saying the smell. What does that smell like to you, Craig?
I like yours. I always quote you when I describe it to clients. The little jalapeno, little vegetal cilantros.
Yeah.
You know.
Okay. And then what about leaflets?
5 to 7.
7, 5 to 9.
As few as 5, as many as 9.
Yes, few as 5, as many as 9, mainly 7. And then hickories in general, for a compound leaf, are they going to be odd pinnately compound or even pinnately compound? Meaning, is there a terminal leaf or not? Or terminal leaflet, sorry.
There is a terminal leaf.
Yeah, which is helpful when distinguishing between hickories and walnut in particular. So ash is also odd pinnately compound. How would you differentiate between hickory and ash?
The way it is.
Just the way it is.
The branching structure.
Branching structure. So what about the branching structure?
The ash trees are also opposite branching.
Yeah. So ash trees opposite hickories are going to be alternate. Okay. And then so how about pignut hickory? Anyone remember the Latin?
Glabra.
Nice. Yeah, Michael with Caria glabra. And what does glabra mean?
Big nut.
Smooth. So glabrous. And then, so what in distinction to mockernut is smooth about pignut? Other than its sweet fall colors. Yeah, rachis. How many leaflets on pignut hickory?
5. Mostly 5.
Mostly 5. Yeah. And so with hickory, you're always wanting to kind of like look at a sample size of leaves, never just one. And then what is one other distinctive feature that you might use to identify pignut hickory?
Snout on the nut.
Snout on the nut.
It's not,
Yeah, and so there are two kind of pig-like features about the nut. One with the entire shuck, you see that snout on the end, which isn't always present. So again, you want to look at a sample size. And then also when you see the nut in cross section, the interior looks like the end of a snout. And then lastly, we won't spend too much time because according to NC State, this is an inferior hickory, which we covered. But the bitternut hickory. Anyone remember this Latin was less useful, but does anyone happen to remember the binomial for bitternut hickory? Caria cordiformis, and that just means heart-shaped. And I can't remember. I think it's some aspect of the nut that was supposed to be heart-shaped. So couple quick ID tricks for bitternut. Anyone remember? There's one in particular that I find really useful.
9 leaves mostly.
Yeah, so of our native hickories that we find in this area, it's going to have the most amount of leaflets. So yeah, frequently 9. Nice. Anyone else? What about the bark? What might you see on a mature bitternut hickory's bark that might be a little bit different from mockernut, shagbark, or pignut?
X's and Y's.
See.
What was that?
The X's and Y's.
So yeah, a lot of those hickories have the X's and Y's. And so that might be less useful for distinguishing between specific types of hickory, but that's a good trait for getting to hickory as a genus.
Wax smoothie. It's like somebody pushed wax with their thumb. It's pretty smooth.
Nice, yeah. So it's not as corky. It's not as distinctly ridged as, and in my personal experience, that seems to be most obvious on larger trees. But when you see it and you start to distinguish, kind of compare it to other hickories, it's pretty noticeable. All right, so that brings us to today's hickory. According to Donald Peaty, who I know David really likes, and I really like. I just finished. I know Michael has also read or listened. Have you read the book? You own the book. Yeah, it's a great reference. He's got like a catalog. What's the title of that book?
Natural History of Trees.
North American.
Yeah, Natural History of North American Trees. Absolutely phenomenal book. He doesn't go into every species, obviously. There are a lot of trees that are native to North America. But he kind of highlights, in his opinion, some of the most notable. And this is one that I really enjoyed his section on. He calls it one of America's noblest trees. And he also, I wrote down another quote. I really enjoyed this. The largest and kingliest of all species of Carya. Pretty high praise from a man who is obsessed with trees. Anyone have any guesses for what hickory we might be covering? Yeah, you can make a pie out of it.
I think I might have an idea. I'm not giving it away.
Well, all right. So does anyone know now, looking at these photos I've provided, what this might be?
Pecan.
Pecan.
It's a pecan.
We'll jump right into that.
Pecan.
So pecan, pecan, and then I also, in prepping for this, I also heard the pronunciation pecan, pecan, and pecan, yeah, which is odd. And it also is, I think, accepted that there is no official right way to pronounce it. So the word itself, pecan, comes from an Algonquin, a Native American tribe, native to I think the interior U.S. and then also eastern Canada. Comes from an Algonquin word, which they use to refer to nuts generally. I read on a pecan farm blog post, so I have no idea how accurate this is, that the etymology of the word, specifically the meaning that the Native Americans attached to it, was any nut that required a rock to break. And then the French, I think, adapted the word to mean specifically pecan trees as we know them. So the Latin for this is Carya illinoinensis, which I bet you can guess what that specific epithet refers to and what it might suggest about the range, the native range of pecan, which we conveniently have up here on the map. So this is a species of pecan that actually is not native to North Carolina, although it plays an important an important agricultural and commercial role in the Southeast. But we'll cover that in a second. So really quickly, some identifying characteristics. So it has a terminal leaf, like all hickories do, but it's not going to be as pronounced as a lot of our other hickories, where the terminal leaflet is oftentimes like the largest of the leaflets, where the leaflets kind of grow in size, climaxing with that terminal leaflet. It also has the highest potential number of leaflets. I think it was anywhere from 9 to 14. I believe I counted. I think there's 9 on this leaf. No. Yeah, 11. And then the leaves just have a very different quality that I don't know if it's the venation or what. I have a hard time putting my finger on it, but immediately when I see a pecan leaflet, it already looks distinctive to me. Because that terminal leaflet is so small, it can be really easy to mix it up with black walnut, especially because pecan lacks the XY braided pattern that we've become familiar with on the other hickories we've covered, and doesn't have shaggy bark like the shagbark hickory. Yeah. And so it's a little bit more blocky, a little bit kind of more of a traditional indistinctive bark, and then it also has a really thin husk on the nuts, so distinguishing it from mockernut hickory. So this is a good time to review what some of our definitions are, because these get used incorrectly by homeowners often to malign certain trees. So what does the term native mean, just in a general sense? Aiden.
Origination.
Yeah, so native and origination, meaning that it grew in an area without any human endeavor to put it there. And just because a tree is native in North Carolina, and if someone wanted a native habitat in their garden, does that necessarily mean something that is native to the coast is going to do really well in our clay soils in the Piedmont because it is a tree native to North Carolina. No. So there's a little bit more specificity of what native means beyond just respecting like artificial boundary lines that we've drawn. It has to do with specific types of habitat. In North Carolina, there are 3 really distinctive physiogeographic regions: the coastal plains, which include the Sandhills as kind of a subregion, the Piedmont, which we're in, and then the mountains. And as it turns out, pecans tend to do the best in the coastal plain. Okay, so this is the one I hear homeowners kind of mix up a lot. The term invasive versus pioneer. Invasive is a good term to know because it does have a pretty specific definition. So giving away the first part of the term invasive, going with Aiden's definition, this is going to be a plant that does not naturally occur in an area without human cultivation. But beyond just not naturally occurring, because it's not that every single tree or plant that people put in their yard from Asia is an invasive by definition of it being exotic. Anyone have an idea what might further qualify a plant as invasive as opposed to just an exotic?
It's going to readily spread on its own.
Yeah, so spreads on its own, that's a huge part, but that can also be naturalized. So a plant can naturalize without necessarily being invasive. What is the real clincher for making a plant invasive? David?
Does it take steal resources from other things that need it?
So that's one potential. So it does measurable damage to an ecosystem. But there are 2 other ways in which it might qualify as invasive that are more kind of like human-centric. And I'll just get to it. It's if it causes any kind of like agricultural or ecological loss, and if its presence in the ecosystem does active harm to human health. Now there are some natives that I would say kind of like do that, so I guess that's where the fact that it's introduced would be important. Like poison ivy can just like get out of sight, out of town. I'm done with it. I'm over it. All right. So what a pioneer is, a lot of people will say like, oh, like sweet gums are super invasive. It's like, no, they're not. They're not invasive in the true like botanical sense of the term invasive. They are pioneer species. Loblollies would also be considered pioneer species. A pioneer species is anything that's going to do really well at moving into disturbed sites, which is the urban environment essentially. Now, a lot of invasives are also really good at doing that, but there are plenty of native trees like the sweet gum that are really good at moving into disturbed sites and kind of taking over. All right, yeah, and so we see, just going back to the range, this is really strictly an interior tree. However, the pecan is strongly associated with the southeast United States, and it turns out we are a massive production center for pecan farming. And pecan is the only real native nut that sees this level of production in an agricultural sense. And that's partly why PD was referred to it so highly, is the nuts are just so highly regarded. And they were very highly regarded by indigenous peoples as well. And it actually became a really important trading tool with Europeans. And so one of the ways in which pecans made it into the southeast was by being deliberately migrated or cultivated, or I think David uses this word in a way that I like, it was franchised by Native Americans into areas where it wasn't naturally occurring because it was so highly valued. I read one source that suggested that it was because of its value to Europeans that the Native Americans or the indigenous peoples began to spread the tree, because they saw it as a way in which they could really become significant trading partners. Interestingly, in the southeast, people refer to it as the Mississippi or Illinois nut, because they knew that's kind of, it was coming over the mountains from the interior U.S. This cracked me up, and it just speaks to the attitude of the early settlers, which are fairly cringeworthy today, and speaks to some of the wisdom of the indigenous peoples that managed this land before we came, especially with regards to like fire suppression and forest management in general. But the way in which the nuts were harvested from a mature pecan tree was often to fell it. You think about like how short-sighted that is. Yeah. I think that America presented itself with a sense of like inexhaustible resources, and generations on, we kind of realized like what a fallacy that was. So yeah, and then similar to the other hickories, it had really excellent timber, so it's highly valued for that reason as well. So some general ecology, it's widely adapted to a pretty distinct array of soil types: alkaline, acidic, clay, loam. As long as it's not sitting too long in water, it likes well-draining soils. And then also fairly drought tolerant. Like other hickories, it's got really high wildlife value. It's a host plant. It's a larval host for a lot of different moths and butterflies, including the Luna moth, which is like one of my personal favorites. They're just, yeah, really beautiful. And then I think it's called the hickory horn devil, or the horn devil, which I would love to see at some point, which is a really large, kind of very rock and roll metal looking, yeah, caterpillar. And then this is also a term we covered a little while ago. Does anyone remember what monoecious means, or can you spell it without looking at the, it'd be a good spelling bee final boss word. Anyone remember what monoecious and dioecious means and why?
One house.
Yeah, yeah, nice. So the etymology, so that was Patrick saying one house, two house. The etymology goes back to Greek, meaning one house or two house. And do you remember what that is specifically referring to?
This monoecious has got both sexes of flowers on the plant. I think in dioecious, two houses, like one plant will have male flowers, one will have female flowers.
So it's actually,
The opposite.
The exact opposite.
yeah, it's the opposite, which took me a long time to like really solidify that.
Yeah.
But yeah, because it means everything. Oh no. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Now I'm getting this up next up. The monoecious meaning,
Hey
okay.
Google.
Yeah.
What is monoecious?
We're just gonna skip over that. Okay. So some urban considerations. So if someone wants a pecan at their house, this isn't like the ideal place in North Carolina for it. Of course, it does grow here. We see it, not infrequently, but it does tend to grow best in the coastal plain, at least according to the extension articles that I read. It does mast every 1 to 3 years. So I think that it probably has kind of significant nut years a little bit more often than acorns or than oaks, and that might be significant if someone has a hickory or a pecan over their house. We can't use that tactic to dissuade them as effectively. Meaning like telling them, oh, this is kind of more of a seldom occurrence. Well, with the pecans, it's going to be a little bit more often. So the largest hickory, 140 feet tall. I think I read that that's pretty exceptional. I think they tend to be around 70 to 100 feet tall, based on what I read. And 140 feet, I think the champion was in Ohio or Texas, somewhere within its native range. And then a really, really broad spread, which even in this area, one of the chief attributes of pecans are these, really, really large spreading limbs. And then also they tend to be brittle. So for those of you who've been doing tree work here, kind of in North Carolina for a long time, what are some of the associations that you think of with hickories and how they fail, or the structural issues they tend to have? I mean, I just said it, so it's brittle, but does that track with your own experience of seeing hickories in the landscapes for the years that you've been working here?
Well, the pecans, yeah, like you see a lot of branch failures.
Yeah, speaking specifically of pecans.
Yeah, definitely, and I regard them as different from the hickories in the way they, maybe because they're planted and cultivated, they tend to be really, decurrent.
Yeah.
And then big failures.
So Craig just used another keyword, decurrent. What does that word mean, Craig?
Broad spreading, like.
Yeah, so anyone know off the top of their head what the opposite of excurrent is? And then what type of tree has a strongly excurrent habitat?
Off the top of it's decurrent.
What's that?
You said, what's the opposite of excurrent?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm getting into the monoecious, dioecious thing again. Okay.
Kind. You're almost out.
So what does decurrent mean?
Broad spreading.
Broad spreading. And what does excurrent mean? Yeah. And so what kind of tree often has a strongly excurrent crown habit?
Evergreens.
Yeah, conifers typically do in general. Yeah. And then since we're talking about like brittle branches in general, so a tree, does anyone remember what aspect ratio means?
Yes.
Specifically with regards to branches. It's an important term when you start to do like risk assessments or deciding what to prune on a tree. It's a term that I think Ed Gilman really introduced into the vernacular of arborists. He talks about it quite a bit in his pruning manual, which everyone should pick up at some point or flip through. It's a great book.
Yeah, trunk to limb or branch taper. And they're like relative size to each other.
Yeah, exactly. So Chase mentioning that aspect ratio is the relative diameter of the branch to the trunk. And then for a structurally strong tree, what do we want to see in terms of an aspect ratio?
1 to 3.
0.5 or less.
Yeah, so in general, thank you, Mike, it's a 0.5 or less. Ideally, half the diameter or smaller. And then what other attribute is present with a small aspect ratio that is not present with a large aspect ratio that has a really significant impact on tree biology, specifically as regards to what removing a live branch might entail in the long term for a tree? I made that question too early. What physical attribute is present on a branch with a small aspect ratio that is not present on a large aspect ratio? Branch collar. Yeah, thank you, Lee. And can you define a branch collar briefly?
Well, it's the area where the branch joins the trunk that has a different cellular makeup than the remainder of it, and it allows the tree to heal over a wound more readily than if it were cut at a place that did not preserve the branch collar.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, really, really nice definition. So it's physiologically different than a larger branch attachment. There are also chemical properties that allow it to retard the spread of decay a little bit better than branches that lack a branch collar if they're removed. So this doesn't really get too much into our end of the industry, the Treeist, but there are some interesting considerations. If someone is wanting a pecan tree for production, and they are using a cultivar, which is almost always used. I know, Craig, this is something that you're familiar with. What can you tell us about pecan pollination?
So you need a 1 and a 2 variety.
So I read, and correct me if I'm wrong, I just came across this last night. There are 1s, 2s, and 3s.
I didn't know about 3s.
Yeah, and then any combination of those, and there are like so many pecan cultivars. There are a lot. I think, what is it? Centennial is like one of the really popular ones.
A lot of them have Native American names like Kiowa, Pawnee.
Yeah.
What is that 1, 2, and 3? What does that signify?
So those are categories of cultivars, and I'm not into nursery production as a curiosity interest, so I'm not sure exactly like why. Can you speak to that at all?
It has to do with the timing of the male and the female parts opening up and receiving the pollen, and you want some genetic variation for the successful pollination of the trees. Obviously an adaptive feature, so you get some mixing. Certain trees are like that, so even though they're monoecious, they still have, you want genetic variation for the successful fertilization.
So does that mean, Sam, to close the loop on that, if I went and bought 2 1s, it would be far less successful if I bought 1 1 and 1 2 and planted them in my yard?
Yeah, in fact, if your goal was nut production, like you failed to do the most basic amount of research on how to get. That's like literally the first thing. The 2 important things about pecan production is choosing a cultivar that's resistant to pecan scab, which we're going to cover really briefly because it's not super important to us.
Yeah.
But it is one of the most significant pests of pecan, but primarily from a production standpoint. But yeah, you'd want either any combination of a 1, a 2, and apparently a 3. So I've got a picture on this slide. If you look at it, you see some spotting on the leaves, and then even some discoloration on the nut. Really briefly, there is a significant fungal pathogen of pecans that affects the leaves and nuts, which can have a massive impact on the total yield of a pecan harvest, reducing it really, really significantly, and that is pecan scab. Based on my brief reading, it typically doesn't spell doom for the tree, but it can be really, really disastrously impactful on the total nut production. It causes lesions on both the upper and the underside of leaves, which is also kind of interesting, and then gets into the shuck or the shuck or the husk of the nut and will stunt it. And it's particularly active in the spring and particularly active in wet conditions. So if you're out looking at pecans around town, take a look at the leaves and the nuts, see if you can see that discoloration. It's probably been a good year for pecan scab. And then another thing I'm seeing frequently on pecans, as well as a lot of other trees, but forest tent caterpillars. And then there's also fall webworm, which in North Carolina is active throughout the year, according to my reading. The way that you differentiate between the two is that the forest tent caterpillar creates its nests kind of at branch unions with the trunk, and the fall webworm creates the nest kind of more towards the end of the branch, and then slowly they'll extend that into the trunk. And there's slightly different behavioral patterns that the caterpillars have around those nests. Like fall webworm, they'll defoliate within the nest itself, and then forest tent caterpillars will use the net, the web as a home base, but they'll travel outside of it during the day.
You should be able to see fall webworm right now.
Yeah, and so again, you can differentiate the two based on the location of the web, but neither of them typically warrants any chemical treatment. One control is to simply knock the nests out. So in general, if someone is wanting to plant a pecan, you want a lot of space for it. They're really large spreading trees. You don't want it over your home because of that propensity towards losing large branches. So one thing I might ask, if I see a large pecan that's got heavy branches over a home, I would ask if the client is aware of like what the pruning history is, to see how much or when the last kind of end weight reduction was done on that tree, and then maybe recommend a bit of a regular pruning cycle for some end weight reduction if, you know, long-term retention of that tree was valuable to the client. Oh, and that's my last slide. Oh, and then one last little interesting bit is looking at the leaflets. One of the other distinguishing characteristics that's really evident in this photo is that sort of recurved quality that isn't always present. Sometimes it's a little bit more soft. It's not as exaggerated as this, but they call that a falcate leaf shape, which if you know your binomials might sound somewhat familiar. Anyone, does that word ring a bell? Yeah, Quercus falcata. So that is the southern red oak. And one of the identifying characteristics of the southern red oak is the scythe shape of the leaves. And if any of you are like RPG gamers, you know what a scythe is.
Oh, you drawn that before.
First attempt. Yeah. So look at the lobes of a southern red oak, and you'll kind of get the gist. And yeah, so another kind of distinctive feature. And any questions on pecan or any other comments, anything that you've noticed as arborists in the area for a while that you would throw into the... All right.
So from a linguistic standpoint, interesting, the pecan, the pronunciation of pecan or pecan is not geographically located. So unlike most linguistic features, you cannot predict how someone is going to say that word based on where they're from.
Ah.
And it's been that way as long as, yeah, they can't find like an origin for where it comes from in terms of the differentiation. So.
Huh.
Interesting.
Something else that I noticed, sorry,
Go ahead, John.
about pecans is like even in the winter, like just they have a typical structure. You could look at them from a long way away. And
How would you give us a description?
I don't have my finger on it
Yeah.
exactly, but like that decurrent shape can be very low on the structure, very low decurrent.
Yeah.
Like there's not a long bulb before it starts to spread. Typically.
It's either a pecan or a river birch.
And if you can't tell based on the bark, you need to hit the book.
If you can't tell
Like
the
just
difference between
familiarize
twigs.
yourself, and it starts to look obvious even
Yeah.
from a long ways away.
So, yeah, thank you, Michael. That's great, because there are certain words, like I read with coyote versus coyote. There are really distinct regional controls on who
Most
says it what
linguistic
way.
features have a linguistic base.
Yeah.
They will have linguistic features based on geography, you know.
Yeah.
And that's a word that just doesn't. So.
Thank you, Sam.